Barku, a breath to spark the human heart. G'day there, friends and family. You're here on the Barku podcast with Mark Philpott, where it's all about exploring some ancient wisdom, some ancient stories, looking for a little bit of inspiration to keep our hearts on fire as we journey through this life which we so happily participate in. I'm sitting in the back of our Toyota Hiace van today, the little blue van in the thumbnail for the Barku podcast. My family and I are on a 3-month trip up the east coast of Australia. We're currently at Crescent Head Caravan Park, which is a beautiful little coastal town just north of Port Macquarie on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. We managed to avoid all of the orange and red zones in New South Wales on the way up the coast, just to ensure we wouldn't have to go into any sort of little COVID lockdowns. And so far, so good. So we arrived in town here at Crescent Head on Monday evening. Crescent Head, if you haven't been up this way, is a beautiful little town. I call it the one roundabout town because basically you come in off the highway through some bush, you hit town, there's a few little houses scattered up a hillside, and on the way into town you hit a roundabout, and the roundabout basically has 3 exits. To the left, the first exit, you have the caravan park, which flanks both the river and the surf beach. The surf beach really is the focal point of the town. It's a little rocky point break with some beautiful little waves that wrap their way in there. There's some pandanus trees on the point, quite a popular spot for people to sit and watch the waves, watch the surf coming in. The second exit to the roundabout is your bowls club and golf club, a couple of little cafes. The golf club actually has, the golf course is basically built on the headland, so quite a steep course with some beautiful views of the surf, and one green in particular sits right on the headland where everybody walks down to the point break to the jump rock. I've just wondered, I wonder how often people actually get hit by golf balls there. Hasn't happened while I've been here, but just the thought that crosses my mind each time I'm walking past there. And the third exit to the roundabout, of course, there's a tavern in town where you can go to grab a little counter meal or have a cool beverage while looking out at the surf beach and watching the sunset. And there's a post office and a couple of other little cafes, and of course a little food works with some overpriced groceries, just in case you forget anything before you come into town. So Monday evening we arrived here at Crescent Head, and you might have heard on the news, there's actually a shark attack here at Crescent Head that evening. So we got into town, we were setting up our tents, and as we were setting up, a bunch of sirens could be heard coming down the hill. A couple of ambulances quickly made their way down into town across the caravan park out to the headland there, followed by a few police cars. And we continued setting up our tent in the dark, just getting things done. As you do, it gets dark pretty early here at this time of year in winter. So we got our tent up and we went up to the tavern for something to eat. Bit of an easy meal after setting up camp. And the bartender, while he was pouring us a couple of drinks, actually said, "So did you see what happened with the shark attack?" And I had no idea at this stage. We'd just come in, set up the tent, heard the sirens. And while we were chatting, a helicopter turned up and landed on the golf course here on the headland. And slowly people started to fill us in on what had happened. There at dusk in the river mouths, a guy from Queensland, I believe, had been surfing with a few mates. Beautiful evening. Heaps of kids in the water when we arrived. Heaps of kids out. Just enjoying some slightly warmer water and a sunny evening, when a 3-metre great white shark came up and took a sizable chunk out of the young man's board and caused some pretty serious injuries to his arm. So the town being a little surf town, this has been the talk of the town all week, and it's been a bit of a buzz. And fortunately, what we've heard so far is that the young man, once he made it to hospital, was in a stable condition. Fortunately for him, a couple of surfers, one who happened to be an anaesthetist, another who happened to be a trauma surgeon, were on the beach at the time, tourniquet his arm, stop the bleeding, and really help to stabilise him before the ambulances arrived. And it sounds like they might save his arm as well, which is really good news. But, in a little surf town, you've come here to surf. A lot of people have come here on school holidays to surf. It raises a few questions about, well, is it safe to jump back in the water? Is there an etiquette here? They did shut the beach the next day, and then the decision really had to be made. What do we do? Do you go back? But this podcast, the point of this podcast, that's just a little story. That's just something that's been happening up here. Big story for that young man and his family, but thankfully he's all right. But as I stated in the last podcast, what I'd like to do is actually dig into some wisdom texts here, and starting with a couple of the parables that Jesus used to teach on his journey through ancient Jerusalem there. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of an explanation about what a parable is. Because a parable is basically a story that puts the familiar next to the unfamiliar to create a bridge between a present version of reality and the divine reality. So when Jesus is using parables, they're not simply to teach a moral principle, they're actually an insight into a different paradigm, a different way of living that's full of new and different possibilities. And often the wisdom in these parables is quite contrary to what humans might naturally tend towards. They might seem to rub up against our instinctual practices, or at least the socially acceptable practices when it comes to dealing with different life situations. So when we think about parables, these stories that bridge between the present reality and the divine reality, we got to understand that these stories were told in a oral wisdom tradition. So Jesus walked around and he didn't write things down. None of the texts we've got are actually written by Jesus. So he wandered around sharing stories, teaching people from village to village. And he was part of a rabbinic Jewish tradition, which actually initially they forbid the writing down of the oral Torah, which was their sacred text, the first books of the Bible. And they forbid writing this oral Torah down for fear that it might become too rigid and inflexible. You see, when stories are told verbally, they maintain a little more life. The logos, or the breathed word. It's a word that has life and it's changing, and it leaves room for creativity and inspiration to respond to new contexts, to new situations. And you can imagine Jesus travelling around. To draw out crowds like we're told he did, he must have had a little bit of charisma. Must have been a bit of a rock star journeying through the countryside with his stories, with his teachings. And you can imagine as he was telling these stories each time, while the same elements were probably present in those stories, he probably took a little bit of creative license to embellish some of these stories, to highlight different aspects or themes that he wanted to teach in different communities. So today what I want to do is present a parable that I've carried with me since I've heard it. And I imagine if you grew up perhaps in a faith tradition, went to Sunday school, or even if you didn't, maybe you did RE at school, this is one that will be familiar to you. But what I want to do is tell it in a new way. So I've sat with the story and I've rewritten it because I want to present it in a way that allows you to hear it with some new ears, to apply a new lens to that story to see what jumps out. Then I want to start to unpack some of the ingredients of the story. We want to look at the three characters who represent three parts of the whole, whether that whole is an individual, a family, or a community. And then we'll get into some stuff on wealth, prostitutes, the fattened calf, hunger, death, and living. So if that sounds all right with you, please join me for an exploration of this little parable. Two boys born of the same blood, raised under one roof, always shown the same love. Day by day in the field by their father's side, the boys now men, restless souls caught fire. The younger son acknowledged his burning desire, decided to leave and let adventures transpire. He approached his father with a brash request. I want an advance on my share of the family bequest. Now to the son's surprise, without hesitation, the father sold his share of the family estate. Then, with a glimmer of recognition in his eye, he handed that son a cheque and bid him goodbye. The young man took to far-off cities with exuberance, no backward glance fueled by youth and hubris. Fat stacks of cash weighing heavy in his pockets, every fetish of his flesh he indulged the lap of opulence. Till it dawned one morning, now waking from his delirium, boy suddenly realized his fiscal freedom, it was dwindling. Sheepish and distraught, he set out seeking payment, heaping pig shit for pork, losing faith as every day went by, until his hunger grew so bad, he remembered even the servants ate better with his dad. So he prepared his confession, he'd plead for compassion, offer up his service in return for a daily ration. Yet upon his return, before he reached the familiar farm gate, his father saw him approaching. Filled with joy, he rushed out to adorn him with new clothes and a signet ring for his finger. Then he ordered the servants to kill the fattened calf for his dinner. A celebratory feast ensued with music, dancing, friends and food. The boy was lost but now is found, the father's joy returned compound. When the older brother approached the house from the fields that night, he was surprised to hear the celebrations in full flight. Then he saw his younger brother was the cause for the festivities, while no one even fetched him from the fields to join in. The older son, his heavy heart bound with envy, accused his father of a foolish inequity. I've slaved in the fields under your orders without indiscretion. I was never rewarded, not even with a goat for celebration. Yet my little brother pisses your property away on prostitutes and cocaine, and when he returns home you order the fattened calf be slain? The father responds to his son's disdain for the situation. Son, you've always been with me and never want for anything. This brother of yours was dead to me and has returned alive. How can we not celebrate what was lost but now shall thrive? So you might recognize there, you might have heard that story referred to as the prodigal son or the lost son. But I wanted to present in a new way because new ways open new possibilities. And let's think about what that means traditionally for that story to be known as the prodigal son. If we adopt the label of the prodigal son, it immediately shifts our focus to that of the younger son. And it immediately implies a judgment about that son's behaviour. Prodigal, wasteful, extravagant, throwing away his family inheritance, which leads to feelings of shame maybe. And the meaning becomes fixed. But who gave it this label? Who gave it the label the prodigal son? I've got no idea. So it doesn't make sense for us to hold on to that if we want to truly engage with this text in all of its richness and wisdom that it holds for us. So other people, there are people around at the moment who are trying to reduce these stories to cautionarily moralizing fables. And this does suit an early stage of faith development, sure. Yeah, it's good to know that some things are better to avoid, to save yourself a little bit of pain, and other things are good to embrace because they are good for you. But if you've had a little bit of life experience, you realise that life isn't so cut and dry. It is far more nuanced than that. You know, as much as we might aim to do the right thing, sometimes we put our energy in places that are just not good for us, good for the people around us, or good for the greater good. And you know what? If we adopt the label the prodigal son, it leads to shame, and shame leads to anger and a lack of self-worth, which only leads to further self-destructive behaviour. So let's ditch the label and let's look at this through a lens like I'd imagine Jesus might have, because when Jesus told stories, he was often holding up a mirror, particularly a mirror that confronted the temple priests and the Sanhedrin, the people in power at the time, the religious authorities of the day. And he held up a mirror that asked them to consider themselves on both sides of the story. So, for example, there's the instance where a crowd brings Jesus an adulteress or a prostitute and says, well, the ancient law says that we should stone her, basically kill her. And Jesus says, well, let he who's without sin throw the first stone. And slowly the crowd dissipates and leaves that poor person alone. And prostitutes are they're a character that keeps coming up in these ancient wisdom traditions. It's something I'll come back to. So let's look at what we got here. So Luke, the book of Luke in which this parable is written, it's the only one of the synoptic gospels that gives us this story. And basically Luke was written 59 to 80 years AD. So it wasn't written down for a significant period of time until after Jesus' death. And what it does here in Luke, the original text, is it just gives us an outline of the story. It gives us the characters, gives us a setting, it gives us the plot. But we can imagine that Jesus, as a dynamic storyteller, was able to add a bit of a rock star element to his storytelling, extrapolating on what caught the attention of the crowd, creating a dialogue that left space for creativity and engagement. So, how can we do that here? In my reading of the text, and I spent a bit of time playing with it, as you heard in my rewriting of it, when you try to put something into rhyme, it gives you time just to chew on the text, just to sink your teeth into it and get to understand it a bit better as you're recrafting it and redrafting it. So here's what I've come to understand about the text through my own reading and retelling of that story. We'll start with the three characters. We've got the three main characters. We've got the father, we've got the older son, and we've got the younger son. And we can think about these three characters as three parts of a whole unit. So that could be three parts of an individual person, which is probably the best place to start when we're applying these stories, is to ourselves. Because if we can't apply it to ourselves, then we have very little hope of taking the next step and applying it to a family unit, perhaps our immediate family, or perhaps to a local community or organisation or a business that we might be a part of. And then to the greater community, the wider community, because these three elements seem to exist on different scales in the system of life, of human endeavour. So, how would you describe these characters? How would you describe the father? Think about the father now. He calmly sells half his property to give his young son an early inheritance. That's it. There's no questions in the text. He just says the son goes to his father and asks for his inheritance, and the father sells up half of what he owns, divides it, and gives the kid a check and sends him off to distant lands to basically have a good time. What does this say about the character of that father? It's quite permissive. You might sound a little bit foolish, really. And then, once the son has taken his property and spent it, all that hard work that he's put into building that property, to building some equity and some wealth, the son takes it, pisses it away, comes home, and then the father, to our surprise, welcomes him home with a feast, new clothes and a ring on his finger. He basically welcomes him back into the family and restores him to his old position. In fact, he esteems him almost more than the older brother who stayed at home. So this father is surprising. I wonder what he'd actually be like. I wonder who in your world might remind you of somebody like the father who behaves in this way, who has so much to give that they're not upset when what they give seems to be taken and used or misused in ways that perhaps conventional wisdom, and conventional, I say, like a worldly view of wisdom, might think is wasteful or prodigal. Then we've got the younger son. I wonder what this guy would be like. And when I say son, now Jesus was speaking in a time that was heavily patriarchal and male dominant. So We can take the gender out of it if you would like to, and we could just talk about the child, the younger child, and that might be more comfortable for some people because it could have been a girl, could have been anybody of any gender who takes off in this manner and travels to far off lands to spend their inheritance on prostitutes and cocaine, before falling to new lows once the money does finally run out, and having to find a job shoveling pig shit for a Gentile, which for a Jewish person to be working for a Gentile in that time, in that context, would have been quite degrading. So this youngest son who takes off, spends his inheritance or her inheritance, and then ends up shoveling pig shit for a Gentile, completely humbled, completely hit rock bottom there before they return home. I wonder what they would be like. But I wonder what they'd be like before they left too in the field. Because then we've got the older brother. So standing side by side in the fields, working in their early days, we've got the older brother who just stays at home working all the time, doesn't get invited to the party, and then ends up confronting his dad in anger over his perceived injustice of the whole situation. Oh, I wonder what he'd be like. When you think about these characters, the older son in particular and the younger son, who would you rather have at a dinner party? Would you rather have the older son or the younger son? Who would you rather take on a surf trip or a camping trip? Who would be more enjoyable, do you think, to be spending your time with? And on the flip side, when you go on that camping or surf trip, which of these sons, if they were living next door, would you be asking to remember to feed the dog and bring the bins in and empty the mailbox while you're away on your trip? Who has the better sense of humour? Who gets the better grades at school? Who's more creative? Who has more flexibility? Who has the sense of adventure? Who's more trustworthy in this story? And see, each of these characters have their strengths. And what Jesus is teaching us here is that Jesus is teaching us that all three parts exist in all of us. You don't get to pick just one. You don't get to just be the adventurous one, just be the anxious one, or just be in that calm, centered, present state where you are in complete flow and living abundantly all of the time. Because as humans, we are caught in a state of flux between all three of these characters. And that's okay. Now, the reason these stories are important is because they increase our capacity to choose and to understand ourselves so that we might choose to do well with the time we're given. And what elements in this story are we talking about when we talk about doing well with the elements that we're given? Well, there's a couple of things I think that we need to highlight here in this story, and we can extrapolate from those ingredients into what that might mean for our life as we navigate using this model that breaks our identity into these three main parts. So, to begin with, the first ingredient that comes into the story is the family inheritance, wealth, money. Money as a store of energy. You see, interestingly, and in a lot of Christian circles, money was a funny thing to talk about, but it comes up time and time again in the wisdom tradition because it's a perfect metaphor for how we invest our energy. And if you think about it, that's exactly what money is. It's a metaphor for our energy. Do we create value in the world? If we do, we have some money. If we don't have any. It's a perfect metaphor for how we invest our energy. And we think about this in terms of this story. And the Father, our present-centered, grounded state within us, that part of us that knows exactly who we are and what we're doing here, that part of us knows that we always have more energy to give. The energy exists abundantly. And that's why the father's not afraid to sell half of what he owns and give it to the younger son when he asks for it. The second element, which ties into this really neatly, is the prostitute. See, it's when the younger son returns home, it's the prostitute in Luke's version of the story, in the outline of the story, it's the prostitute that the old brother gets hung up on. He takes your inheritance and spends it with prostitutes. And we've got to understand a prostitute is not simply, it wasn't like he was just out having massive orgies, blowing all his money at a brothel. The prostitute in the ancient wisdom tradition here represents anything, any activity, any pursuit that we might desire and pursue that robs us of our energy. Anything that we might invest ourselves in that really leads to nothing. It's purely an economic exchange where we put some energy in, there's instant gratification, but very little comes from that interaction. There's no greater reward. There's no fruit that will come from that relationship. It's frivolity. And you know what? In life, prostitutes take many, many different shapes and forms. And I don't mean that in the way you might have just thought. I mean that in the way that there are lots of different things that try to rob us of our energy. We have devices in our pocket that can easily take hours and hours of our time and focus and energy as we scroll through meaningless pictures of other people's lives, or surfing through endless hours of entertainment that really do nothing for improving our hearts and minds. But when you think about it, you know what? We all use things sometimes, and particularly in a response to pain, because sometimes life dishes out things that are outside of our control. And you know what? Using a prostitute to feel better just for a little while, well, that's only human. And Jesus is recognizing that in this story. And it's also the part of the story that the older son feels like he's most missing out on. It's an interesting thing. Like the thing that he highlights is obviously the thing that comes to mind for him as the thing that he feels he's most missing out on, that he's most jealous of in his younger sons, in his younger brother's behavior. So we've got money as energy, which we can invest in prostitutes for instant gratification that leads to very little. But that leads to, and as it does for the younger son, it leads eventually, if we invest all our resources into things that have no return, it leads to a state of hunger. And it's his hunger that leads that young man to return home to his father. In Luke's outline of the story, there's a turning point, a moment when he realizes as he's feeding the pigs and sees what the pigs are eating, what he's feeding the pigs seems to be better than what he's eating. And he remembers that even his father's servants ate better than these pigs and than he is at the moment. So he returns home to satisfy that hunger, that need that he has deep within him. And these stories are part of how we can nourish our spirit and our soul. Because without them, it's too easy to get lost and never find our way back. I think of these stories a bit like breadcrumbs. No matter how far off the path we journey, no matter where we take ourselves off to find a little bit of relief from things that may have happened in life, if we have a trail of breadcrumbs, then we can find our way home. One of the things I noticed working with young people over the last 12 years, as faith traditions have essentially been discarded here in Australia, is that without any animating narrative, any real stories to come back to, young people are sort of left in the sea of life with no real wisdom to help guide them home. And if we can't find our way home, then we're destined just to float through life on a subpar sort of existence level, never really stepping into who we're supposed to be, into the fullness of life, and really a life of abundance and joy and fulfillment that comes from knowing that you are in line with your center, that you are living out of that sense of spirit, that this is what I'm here for, an inspired life. Because anything less just doesn't seem to cut it. So how do we turn this story into some breadcrumbs that you can take away with you for this week? And the image I want to leave you with comes from the Incubus song Drive. You remember that one? And the lyrics start something like, sometimes I feel the fear of uncertainty stinging clear, and I ask myself how much I let the fear take the wheel and steer. But lately I'm beginning to find that I should be the one behind the wheel. You know that one, right? So imagine yourself, this is your car of life on its way, on its journey through the streets. And I want you to picture in that car 3 characters from today's story. You've got the father behind the wheel, hopefully behind the wheel most of the time, that present, centered, grounded place of spirit within you. Then you've got the 2 sons, one that represents a bit of adventure. He's sitting in the front seat choosing the radio station, perhaps calling out suggestions of where you might head next. And then you've got the older brother who represents anxiety, sitting in the backseat driver, who's cautiously trying to make sure that the journey is safe for everybody. He's the one you want behind the wheel when you're driving through the 40 zone between the retirement village and the kindergarten in the afternoon while everybody's trying to cross the road, just to make sure everyone stays safe, because they all have a place. And in reality, it's not a clear-cut distinction between one of the 3 characters who are in charge at any one time. In reality, all 3 parts are intertwined and they interplay in our hearts and minds as we try to work our way through life. And these models are just a helpful way to think about that, a helpful tool for reflection, and a helpful way to find our way back to spending more time living out of who we are truly called to be, out of our God center, out of that place of grounded spirit within us, whatever you might call it. At the start of this episode, I talked a little bit about the shark attack and the conundrum that it left us with here in Crescent Head about what do you do the day after a shark attack. You know, it's a pretty serious shark attack, and there's a 3-meter great white shark presumed to still be hanging about in the local region. And the conversation obviously goes to, well, is it really any more dangerous today than yesterday? Is it any safer today, perhaps, than it was the day before? Because maybe that shark has moved on. There's definitely been more eyes on the water. There's been a drone up in the air checking out the region, looking for sharks. And essentially how I made the call to get back in the water the next day, I bumped into a mate from Torquay and we talked each other around to, okay, there's a little more perceived risk the day after a shark attack, but in reality, those sharks are out in the water every day. So essentially we let that younger brother take the lead, that sense of adventure, that sense of risk, that faith that things are going to be okay, because getting back in the water is a bit like returning to the farm for me. It's that place where I get that sense of really becoming alive. You step off the land into the water and there's a renewal of spirit that takes place in the ocean that you can only understand if you give your life over to it. So whatever that ocean is, whatever farm you're returning to, whatever it means to you to return to that present-centered, grounded place of spirit and love in your life, I wish you all the best this week. And until next time, Baku.